Novel. Prep 1. Oliver Twist. Oliver in London. As we know that Oliver had suffered enough since his first day of birth. So his mother died after giving him birth. He was neglected by the drunken nurse and the careless doctor. Then he was encountered with Mrs. Man, who was really rough and tough like a man, and was also careless, mean, and treated him and the other children with negligence at the baby farm. Then Oliver was treated badly and beaten by the beadle Mr. Bumble at the workhouse for no crime but for asking for more food. Then life began to be harsher for him when he moved to Mr. Sowerberry's shop, where Mrs. Sowerberry mistreated him, giving him the rest of the dog's food, letting him sleep among the coffins. Also was humiliated by Noah, the charity boy, who was calling him by bad names and insulted his mother. So Oliver couldn't tolerate all this. He decided to escape to London, where Mr. Bumble, Mrs. Sowerberry, could not find him there. It was a long, tiring trip for a child. It took 7 days. Okay? With a piece of bread and some water and a torn shoes. When he reached a little town of Barnet, just outside London, exhausted, he sat down the side of the road. His feet were bleeding and he was covered with dust. He met Jack Dawkins, who was well known as the Artful Dodger. He was very clever at getting what he wanted. Okay, that's why he's called artful. And Dodger, because he couldn't be caught when he did something wrong. Then Oliver went to London with him. London was a hope and a dream for Oliver, that nobody could follow him there. London was a symbol of hope for him, as we said, but the truth that was, it disappointed him. The streets of the districts were narrow and dirty, muddy, and there were terrible smells everywhere. Children wandered everywhere in a late hour of the night, screaming and fighting. Pubs were full of people fighting. Evil-looking men were standing in dark corners and also fighting. Then they reached a dark hall, went up through dark and broken stairs, where old Fagin and his gang stayed. The walls of the room were dull, black with old age and dirt. Fagin was standing in front of the fire, cooking, dividing his attention between the cooking and the handkerchiefs which were hanging near the fire. There were rough beds and 4 or 5 boys around the table, smoking and drinking like middle-aged men. When Oliver met Fagin, he smiled at him and shook hands. Then all the young boys came up to him, shaking their hands very hard, and they were checking Oliver's pockets. Fagin was an old man with a horribly ugly face and red hair. wearing dirty cold coat. He didn't want to draw Oliver's attention about or to the handkerchiefs. So he said that they taken out all of them to wash, okay, and to get dry by the fire. Okay, he fed Oliver and gave him some wine and some water, and then Oliver fell asleep. In the morning, Oliver fell deep asleep. Then Fagin was alone with him, and the other boys went working. He was boiling coffee in a pan, and when it was done, he turned towards Oliver to make sure that he was in a deep sleep. But Oliver was just awake with half-closed eyes. Then Fagin locked the door, and from a hidden hole in the floor, he took out a small box, which he carefully placed on the table. He took out a watch covered with jewels and was completely happy and excited about the boys. He described them as being loyal because they never informed the police about him, or also the priests. Okay, then, as Fagin was taking out 6 more watches, as well as rings, bracelets, and money and other jewels, at that moment, he looked up and saw Oliver watching him. Immediately, he brought a knife, went to Oliver and threatened him with it, asked him if he saw anything, and asked him if he weren't awake an hour later. Oliver, terrified, answered that he couldn't sleep any longer, and that he promised that he wasn't awake. Then Fagin's voice began to be warm, okay, and began to be kind, and told him that it was a joke to see if Oliver was brave or not. Oliver was young, naive, and with no experience except that of working at Mr. Sowerberry's shop. But he wasn't stupid. He wondered how this old man lived in such a bad condition, and he had got all this fortune, all these jewels, watches, and handkerchiefs. Then he thought that maybe because he had lots of the children, and he spent his money on feeding them. Then Fagin was cunning. He was a cunning old man. He wanted to show and train Oliver how to be one of the gang, how to steal without being caught. And Oliver, as being innocent and naive, played the game several times after watching it. And to Fagin's surprise, he was just perfect. Then he let Oliver go with the boys to work. The work, that means to steal people. The Dodger and Charlie Bates, okay, robbed an old gentleman and escaped, leaving Oliver behind, amazed of what was happening, until he was caught by the police. Now, guys, we have Oliver Twist, okay? We have the questions, and we have also the answers. Thank you very much.